All right, good morning. Hello, my name is Rob Ramrath, and I am a Game Change Agency host on the GCA Studios, brought to you by Game Change Agency. Today, I'm going to be talking to Jay Leader about change and ambiguity. So, good morning, Jay.
Good morning, Rob.
First, let me frame this up a little bit, Jay. Around 500 BC, Buddha said, everything changes and nothing remains the same. Nothing is without change. Spencer Johnson wrote in 1998, Who Moved My Cheese, which was something of a seminal work, very simple book, a delightful read to get a handle on change and their reactions. And then, of course, we've got Clay Christensen wrote The Innovator's Dilemma in 1997, talking about sort of what happens to big corporations in response to change. So change has been around for a long time. I just gave examples that show a 2,500-year history of conversation on change. I think there's a truism that the pace of change always increases. I think there are historical periods when change is accelerating, and I think this is one of them now. We had the Industrial Revolution, and now, of course, we have the Internet age. And people argue that really the Internet age is actually coming onto its own just now and is really forcing huge change. We take a look at some poster children of Uber and Lyft and Airbnb, and of course no one would argue that Amazon is changing everything. But along with change, there's more to it. There's ambiguity that people and organizations have to grapple with. It's really hard when A is changing to B, but it's really harder when you don't know where B is. You know where A is, that's where you're sitting. You're threatened existentially by something, but you don't know what's going to happen when you get there. Examples of that is Amazon is killing brick and mortar, but there's some role for it. It needs to be there, but nobody knows what it is. They're struggling for profitability. And of course, we look at what's going on with network TV and cable providers. They're in for a wipeout, but nobody really knows how that's going to pan out. So what are people to do? There are reactions and there are responses. We as leaders have to do more than help. Otherwise, there's just paralysis. I'd like to discuss that with you today. Okay, Jay?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Outstanding. And I know you have the answers, so I'm going to learn from you, and I think everybody's going to learn from you. So first, tell us a little bit about yourself, your changes and disruptions that you've dealt with along the way in your career path.
Well, we'll see what I know and what I don't. I guess you'll be the judge at the end. But yeah, so my current role, I'm the Senior Vice President of IT and Chief Information Officer at Rocket Software, which is an enterprise software provider in the Boston area. And kind of uniquely, I also had our customer experience operations. So all of the things that touch customers aside from sales and finance and trying to really drive a positive experience. And, you know, for our customers, and I've been in this business for about 35 years. And when I think back about change and ambiguity, you know, I started my career in the mini computer business in the mid 80s, which is an industry that doesn't exist anymore. And I was in environmental consulting, and that's an industry that's radically changed, right? If you think about the environment in 1984 and you think about climate change now, I mean, look at the changes there. And I've been in consulting, and I was in robotics, which is an industry that, you know, really is at the forefront, right? And so, you know, I've been in businesses where ambiguity exists because survival is at stake, like the mini computer business, but I've also been in businesses where ambiguity is about the future, where robotics is a good indicator of that. So I've spent most of my career being unsure of what would happen in one way, shape, or form. And, you know, I think the way that you manage change and the way that you manage ambiguity is almost more important than whatever the change is, because some of it is controllable. And I think our ability to adapt and take advantage of opportunities when they exist and minimize risk when it doesn't really is a leadership quality that I think can be resident and can really help lead people through change and ambiguity.
Excellent. That's great. Perfect, Jay. So you've been through a lot. I think all of us have. And your involvement with the customers and customer service throughout your career. I remember that you had supply chain responsibility as well. as part of your career. And then, of course, the IT part, which is constantly driven by relentless change. So if you parse out a bit for me, this idea of change with ambiguity and change without ambiguity, where are you seeing people experiencing both kinds? Maybe you could give us some examples.
Yeah, well, I think, as you mentioned kind of in your opening, I think there's always been ambiguity and there's always change. Change is constant. But I do think that one of the big differences today is the velocity and pace of change. And just like anything else, things get faster over time, and I think change is no different. And our ability and need to react and to manage that change and ambiguity is no different. But I also think that, and maybe this has been true all along, I don't know, but the personal impact is so high now. And I think that's what causes so much discomfort among people. It's not that they fear change in and of itself. I think, most people, regardless of your kind of stage of life, but certainly at our stage of life, we've been through change enough and we have enough cycles to understand that things are going to change. But I think where it becomes an issue and where it becomes discomforting is when you can't figure out how that change will impact you. And if you go way back to, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I mean, safety and security is at the bottom of that pyramid, right? And I think as change happens, the natural inclination for people is to try to immediately figure out, well, how does that change impact me? Will it impact me positively or negatively? And then if it's not a question of positive or negative, then it's a question of, well, how? So it might not be positive. I will still have a job, but what will that job be? And will I be able to stay at this company? And do I have skills that will scale? And will I be relevant? Those are all things that we all care about, regardless of your station in life and regardless of your position within a company. So, I think the ability to help people understand that and manage through change and ambiguity is really, really important.
Yes, agreed. You mentioned fear as a common reaction. We all in our lives, personal, professional, we've experienced change, and we've somehow come through the other end of it. Why does people still react with fear, and how do you help them with that?
Well, again, I don't know if it's more or less than it's ever been, but because there's so much information available now, I think in the old days, you kind of didn't know what was going on in a lot of cases. And so you weren't worried about things because you couldn't see them and you couldn't absorb them and understand them. Whereas now, everything is public and everything is immediate. And, if you think about government, I mean, something happens in North Korea and we find out about it seconds later. I think in the 50s and 60s and 70s and maybe even in the 80s, it could have happened and we never would have known about it. Now it shows up on our TV screen or on our mobile phone. And I think there's just that rising awareness of risk just, I think, helps drive a rising fear of, oh my goodness, I mean, I never knew that problem existed. And now maybe it impacts me. And I'm not sure I'm happier knowing than I didn't know.
Wow, that's a really insightful point, Jay. I had not considered that what you're saying, I think, is that not only do people have to grapple with the change that is impacting them directly, to your point, but now they're also flooded with changes around the entire planet that they have to make a decision. Do I care about that or not? Does it impact me or not? Maybe it doesn't impact me, but I still care from a humanitarian perspective, for my kids, for the future. What does it mean for them? And that all of that piles on in addition to grappling with it for themselves.
I don't think it's a coincidence that every American president in my lifetime starts their term with a hair that's one color and ends their term with gray hair. And I think they'd all tell you that it's because what they know and what they have to think about and what they have to worry about and is much more than you or I. And I think that plays a large role.
Wow, that's an interesting point. So that relates also from a leadership perspective. You and I touched on this as we were preparing. What can a leader do with regard to the management of information? What is shared? What isn't shared? How it's shared? When it's shared? to be helpful to a person in reacting to the change and then responding to the change? And I'm going to make this a compound question also. I think there's a difference between react and respond. And I think that we can help manage each. So maybe you can put that together a little bit and talk about that. What can we do as we manage information to help people react and respond?
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, and that it's definitely on point. And so one of the things that I always try to do with my teams and with myself, because I worry just like everybody else does, I'm not immune to that either, is I really try to focus on what I do know and what I can control. And what's the process that we think about the problems in front of us and that we think about the alternatives or potentially what could happen. And I think, you know, I've always been blessed with the understanding that there's a difference between a bad decision and a bad outcome. And sometimes things don't come out the way that you wish or that you plan. But that doesn't mean that you made a bad decision. And I think we can control a lot about the way that we decide and our preparedness for a given situation without necessarily knowing how it's going to come out, but focusing on what we know, not on what we don't know. Because I think in most cases, as I think back over my career, we've known, you know, anywhere between 50 and 80% of what we needed to know to make a decision or to take a direction. It's that, you know, 20 to 50% that causes the uncertainty and that causes the ambiguity. But if we do a great job at defining the 80 and understanding the 80% that we do know, and if we think hard about, okay, so what are the various ways that that other 20% could play themselves out, we're at least prepared. And I think if you have a story that explains, here's why we thought what we thought, and here's why we did what we did, despite the fact that it didn't come out that way, the way that we had anticipated, this was our thinking and this was our logic. And my experience has been, in the many, many times that we didn't figure it out the right way, our thought process was solid. And at the end of the day, our management said, we understand it didn't come out the way we had hoped or anticipated, but we know why it came out that way and we understand the way that you thought about it. And I think the more cycles that you put into that thinking and the more that you are inclusive in terms of this is what we're thinking about and why, and these are our objectives, I think the more holistic a solution you get. I also think that people's ability to participate in the planning and in the thinking about solutions gives them comfort because they feel like they have an ownership stake and they feel like they have a little bit of control. And context is so important. If people at least understand directly, this is why we're doing what we're doing, this is why we're saying what we're saying, these are the outcomes that we're hoping for, these are the objectives that we're shooting at, then it gives them comfort and it gives them a sense that they can participate. And I think the most disconcerting notion is when things are going on around you and you just have no role or no idea. That's where I think it's most difficult for people to absorb.
Yeah, agreed. So it sounds like, Jay, you bias towards transparency and really filling in the dots for people as you give them transparency.
Yeah, that's very definitely true, and that's one of my core operating principles that I've had for a long time. Is I will tell you as much as I know, as frequently and as soon as I know it, because you know, the collective wisdom of a group is so much more robust and so much more comprehensive than the genius of an individual. And we might get it right, and maybe I'm smarter than everybody else, but it usually isn't the case. And having other people participate and understanding the context almost always yields a better result.
Absolutely. That's one of Covey's 7 behaviors of successful people.
Sure.
Absolutely. I'd like to talk a little bit about the characteristics of the people that you work with and how you might modify your behaviors in helping them with change and ambiguity. Because I've witnessed there are those people who are emboldened, there are those people who become paralyzed. How do you get the best from both, and how do you get the most leverage? And I use that in a real positive term. How do you get the best from people, and how do you manage them differently?
Well, I think it's really important that you play to each individual's strength, and it can't be a one-size-fits-all kind of formula. It's never been that way for me. And I think if you look at successful sports franchises and successful businesses, they leverage off the strengths of their people and of their businesses. And I think different people react in different ways, and different people bring different things to the table. I am a gregarious, kind of verbal, very spoken person. But I appreciate those, and in some ways, more highly value people who are perhaps the opposite of me, who are more measured, perhaps more academic, more thoughtful, less verbal, because I think it just provides a much more well-rounded solution. And I think you have to find what works for each individual, because every individual brings something to the table. They wouldn't be on your team if they didn't. But I think you have to figure out, how will it work for person A? I can just tell person B right directly, hey, this is going to be bad. Person C might need a whole different preparation and a different kind of approach. And what I've learned is that what's comfortable for me, or what satisfies me, quite frequently is not what works for other people. And so I think it's really important to play to the strengths of your people, and find the way for them to hear it the way that they will accept it and be able to process it. It's more work, certainly, but I think it yields a much better overall solution.
Absolutely. I find that trust is an enormous component of being able to help people manage through change and ambiguity. That if you have a history of, I'll use the word impeccable behavior. I like that word because it's not perfect, because we're all far short of perfect. Speaking for myself, a long way. But I do attempt to be impeccable with my behavior, and that you can build up that trust over time. However, I've also found that with some folks, a long history of absolutely trustful behavior doesn't matter much to them, and they're still going to be part of the rumor mills, which is very destructive through change and ambiguity. How have you dealt with that? Rumors can be so destructive, and they tend to get amped up when things are getting hard. Like you mentioned, with some people, you'll just tell them this is going to be bad. In those periods, you get this dynamic going on with rumors that's really hard to deal with. What do you do to handle that?
So I think that I think trust and transparency are inextricably linked. And I think the best way to quell the rumor mill is to tell people exactly what you know, so that there's nothing out there for them to speculate on. Remember, rumors are speculation about what has not been said or what has not been done. And I think, part of what you get from transparency is that trust. And I think it's critically important as a leader that when you tell people, this is what I think and this is what I know, that they accept that, and that there isn't more behind that. Because if they don't accept that, then they walk away thinking, what isn't he telling us? What isn't he saying? What does he know that he's not sharing? And I learned a long time ago that it's okay to say, I know more than I'm sharing with you, but I can't or won't share it. At least then people know, right? But I think it served me very, very well for a long time that people trust and believe, if I'm telling you that it's this, then you can count on that it's this, at least for today, or at least as far as I know, it's this. I can't promise you that this is going to happen or that this is what it means, but this is what I think it means, and this is what I think is going to happen. And to the degree that people trust and believe in your transparency, then they won't go to the water cooler and speculate. And just as I'm sure you have, Rob, over the years, I've sat in front of people, CEOs on down, who they talk to you and you walk away going, I don't believe a word of that. There's much more going on here, and I don't believe it. And that's a poisonous environment. That's why I would rather overtell people or run the risk of saying something that, maybe is a little premature, in the interest of them not spending those wasteful and cancerous cycles subverting what you're trying to get done, either today or in the future.
Yeah, agreed. We talked for a moment about people who are emboldened by change and the ambiguity. Can change be fun? Can ambiguity be fun? How as you as a leader can make it fun for people? And can
Well, I think that's the most fulfilling part of being a leader, honestly, is empowering people and watching them seize those moments and opportunities and watching them be able to chase their ideas or chase their dreams. You know, I'm frequently energized by people that are early in their career that haven't been jaded and perhaps are a little bit naive in what's possible and what's not possible. And I think the worst thing that you can do as a leader is to bound people's ambition or bound their empowerment. Why would I possibly try to hold you back if you're personally motivated to help me or our company carry a mission forward? And by far the most rewarding parts of my leadership career have been watching people take ideas to fruition, to be able to own them and drive them. And, you know, this is a blinding glimpse of the obvious, but people are obviously much more bought in when they get to participate and they get to own. And so I learned a long time ago what I call the dirty little secret of management, which is that if people on my staff do good work, I benefit and get credit for that too. So why would I possibly hold back 150 people trying to do excellent work in the interest of having control or trying to manage or bound them? I think there are limits to that. I mean, obviously, you know, there are budgets and constraints that we all deal with, but my kind of philosophy is I'm going to outline where the outsides of that sandbox are, and then I'm going to walk away and let you do your thing. And I think people appreciate that, and you're really strong people want that, and they seize those moments and opportunities.
That's excellent. I recall one exercise that I go through with people during heavy times of change is we do a brainstorming on the kinds of changes that are in play right now in industries outside of our own. And of course, invariably things like Airbnb and Uber comes up. Then I took them to another stage of it and say, let's start brainstorming of what is going to completely disrupt Uber. And then of that disruption, what other industries are going to be disrupted by it? And I recall, of course, autonomous driving vehicles comes up. It's going to blow up Uber. Sure. And then we start to parse out what are the industries that are also going to be blown up and what industries are going to be enhanced. And I'll never forget the most clever one I heard was that the windshield wiper industry will be blown up. Really? Yeah, because you don't have to look out the windshield when you're being driven around by your autonomous car. So we can have fun with that as well. Let's go, we got about 5 minutes left, Jay. So let's go up the ladder, so to speak, of hierarchy. Let's talk about organizations, you know, organisms, corporations. And they also have reactions and responses to changes. What are some of those ranges of reaction and response that a corporation hits as an organization? Yeah. And what are the characteristics of organizations that will thrive through change and or ambiguity as well?
I think, yeah, that's a great point and a great question. You know, and I've worked at companies in the late stages of maturity to the point where they went out of existence, and all the way to companies that were pre-IPO startups that weren't, you know, their future was not assured, and then every place in, you know, in between. And I think part of it depends on where you are in your life cycle, of course, but I also think that there are some common elements. And I think one is, you know, the pursuit of excellence, right? And not just the pursuit of profit or the pursuit of stockholder satisfaction, but the pursuit of excellence, I think, is really important. I think humility is incredibly important. And, you know, the fact that you're successful today doesn't mean that you are immune to disruption or that your business couldn't change substantially or go away in the future. And, you know, I know of a local company, a quite successful local company here in the Boston area. You know them as well, although I don't know if you know who they are. They actually have a group chartered by the CEO that works separate from the rest of the company to figure out how would you put us out of business. If you were to start a business to disrupt us, company X, what would you do to put us out of business? And I think history is littered with companies who thought that they were bulletproof or who believed in their genius because of success that they had at one point, and they weren't humble or thoughtful enough about growing and evolving and changing. And there are very few companies left in America that look like they looked when they started. And I think it's incredibly important to be humble and curious and to continue to pursue and innovate, not just rest on your laurels and not just try to maximize your pay or your stockholder brand. Those are all important, of course, and no one would argue that. But what leads and what's the most important? I think those things in my career have manifested themselves in the companies that are really good.
Excellent, thank you. Last question, Jay, as we're coming up on our time limit. Are there any methods that can be employed to help people and organizations respond more productively and effectively to change and ambiguity? So I'm talking about methodologies as opposed to just management approaches or leadership.
Yeah, I don't know specifically that there are formulas to follow, but again, I'll go back to what I said before, is that stay focused. Let's focus on what we know and what we control, what we can control and what we can learn. And let's try to minimize the distraction and minimize the worry about what we don't know or what we can't figure out or what remains open, right? And staying focused on mission. Don't listen to what other people are saying. Don't worry about what other people are doing. You know, the Bill Belichick, do your job, right? I mean, the Patriots mantra of do your job, right? If we lead properly, we'll pull the pieces together. The pieces will be happier and more productive if they're left alone to do their jobs well and we orchestrate them. That to me is it's not a methodology, but that's kind of a philosophy that's always worked for me.
Excellent. Well, Jay, I would work for you, that's for sure.
I'd be glad to have you.
As I knew you would be, you've been extremely insightful, out of the box and provocative. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers will learn a lot as well. I'd like to offer you my sincere thanks for joining us today, Jay.
It's been a pleasure, Rob. Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you. Take care.